we give thanks for this most faithful life. I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty.
We give thanks for this most faithful life. Yet the heavy inheritance of sovereignty always demands a price that few are truly prepared to pay. Behind the massive, gilded doors of Buckingham Palace, the illusion of royal unity has completely shattered. King Charles has just survived the ugliest, most venomous confrontation with Queen Camilla, and according to those deep within the royal corridors, she has earned every single ounce of the isolation that is coming her way. The Queen Consort was caught doing something the palace administration had explicitly warned her to never go near, an act of defiance that crossed a sacred line of trust. This time, facing his own mortality and the fragile future of his house, Charles did not look away. He cut her off completely, stripping her of influence and dropping the full weight of royal authority directly into the hands of Prince William and Catherine. Camilla has been left with virtually nothing, no political power, no institutional leverage, and she is described by insiders as absolutely livid. The terrifying aspect of this situation is not just her anger, but the cold, calculating moves she is making right now behind closed doors. People inside the palace are genuinely frightened because what Camilla is quietly planning is not a mere emotional outburst. It is a strategic threat to the survival of everything this modern monarchy has left, and the worst part of this internal war has not even started yet. To comprehend how the foundations of the House of Windsor cracked so violently, one must look back to the sudden fall of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the king's own brother. It was a freezing winter morning in Norfolk, England, a day that began like any other quiet, ordinary day for the royal family. But before the sun could set, the British monarchy was dragged into the deepest, darkest crisis of its modern existence. Police vehicles pulled up outside a secluded country property, and Andrew was placed under arrest on his very own 66th birthday. The breaking news sent shockwaves through the global media, officially citing charges of misconduct in public office. However, what sat behind those sterile legal words was an explosive truth that made the entire nation go completely cold. While serving as a high-level British trade envoy years prior, Andrew had allegedly been feeding highly classified government intelligence directly to Jeffrey Epstein, the notorious American billionaire who had spent decades exploiting vulnerable underage girls and collecting compromising secrets about the most powerful men on earth. This was no longer a simple family embarrassment or a tabloid scandal to be swept under the rug. This was a catastrophic state security disaster wearing a royal face. To understand why this moment fundamentally broke the palace, you have to understand the true nature of the network Andrew had entangled himself with. Epstein was not merely a wealthy criminal. He was a master manipulator who built an entire empire around accessing, compromising, and controlling the global elite. He held powerful politicians, billionaires, and global celebrities inside his dark orbit, and every single one of them had a secret they desperately did not want the world to discover. That leverage was his ultimate weapon. The revelation that a senior member of the British royal family had been delivering classified state information to such a man raised terrifying questions about how deep the compromise ran and how many years the palace had spent hiding the rot. That very morning, King Charles sat inside his private chambers, his body already exhausted and being eaten alive by cancer, watching his brother's arrest replay endlessly across every television screen in Britain. But the detail that ignited a furious public backlash was the leak confirming that Charles was not shocked by the arrest. Not even close. According to high-level insiders, Charles had known about the depth of Andrew's activities for years. He knew exactly what his brother had done. He knew the nature of the monsters Andrew associated with, and yet he had looked the entire British public in the face and chosen absolute silence. The most powerful family in the nation had wrapped their protective arms around a predator's associate and hidden him from accountability, and the evidence supporting this complicity was damning. Intelligence officials later confirmed that Andrew's operations had been under active surveillance for a very long time, and those highly sensitive intelligence reports had been delivered directly to the palace desks on multiple occasions. Yet the palace did nothing. Every single action ever taken against Andrew came only after public outrage made continued silence more dangerous than public exposure. His removal from public duties followed a disastrous television interview where he claimed to have no recollection of his victims, a performance so cold and detached that the public revolted. By the time his titles were stripped, the damage was permanent, and the palace was accused by legal experts of actively perverting the course of justice. The public's anger boiled over into open hostility. During a royal walkabout at Lichfield Cathedral, a day meant to showcase warmth and community connection, the fragile illusion of royal respect was shattered. As Charles walked along the barricades, smiling and waving, a man broke through the cheers and screamed directly into the king's face, demanding to know how many years the palace had covered up the truth and why the police had been kept away from his brother. Charles kept walking, his face a frozen mask, refusing to acknowledge the question, but that silence was far more damning than any confession. Public trust began to hemorrhage in real time, with national polls indicating that support for the monarchy had plummeted to historic lows. More than half the population believed the institution was actively protecting its own at the expense of justice, and the family was ripping itself apart from the inside. Andrew's own daughters were consumed by shame and rage, unable to stand behind a father who refused to look his victims in the eye. Seeing the imminent collapse of the monarchy, Prince William knew he could no longer wait for his father to act. Within hours of the arrest, William took complete control of the crisis management team, moving with a chilling, calculated speed that proved this was a moment he had long prepared for. William had been raising the alarm about the danger of protecting Andrew for nearly a decade. He had begged his grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth, and his father to banish Andrew permanently to protect the crown's survival, but his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. The late Queen, blinded by her fierce maternal devotion to Andrew, refused to cast him out, and Charles had remained paralyzed between his loyalty to his mother and his own weak instincts. Now, the exact catastrophe William had warned them about had arrived, and the very family that had dismissed him was now desperately relying on him to save them from total ruin. Yet, as William began executing his ruthless strategy to cut Andrew away from the monarchy forever, a betrayal was brewing within the palace walls that would pour pure gasoline onto the fire. While the nation reeled from the arrest, Queen Camilla was privately on the phone, establishing a secret line of communication with Sarah Ferguson, the ex-wife of the arrested prince, whose own name was deeply entangled within the international scandal files. At the precise moment William's team was working day and night to sever every visible link to the scandal, Camilla was offering comfort and personal loyalty to a liability. When word of this secret alliance reached William, he did not view it as a mere lapse in judgment. He viewed it as an open declaration of war against his authority. William realized that the greatest threat to the monarchy was no longer just the external fury of the public or the criminal investigations of the police. The true danger was sitting right beside the king on the throne, manipulating the fading monarch for her own survival. And William was prepared to do whatever it took to eliminate that danger before the crown was completely destroyed. The true weight of the absolute authority that Prince William has assumed can only be measured by looking closely at the immense physical and emotional cost paid by the man he took it from. King Charles became the sovereign of the United Kingdom in September 2022 at 73 years old, making him the oldest person in British history to ever ascend the throne. To understand his psychological state during this current crisis, one must remember that Charles had been the heir apparent since 1952. He spent an astonishing 70 years in waiting, 7 decades of watching from the wings, preparing, and standing perpetually in the immense shadow of a mother who outlived every historical expectation. Charles had already become a grandfather before the heavy gold of St. Edward's crown was ever placed upon his head. No human being in the long, turbulent history of the British monarchy had waited longer or more patiently for the single moment that was supposed to define his life, his legacy, and his place in history. And then, in a twist of fate that felt cruel beyond measure, just 17 months after that lifelong dream was finally realized, cancer came knocking on his door. The specific type of the disease was kept closely guarded by the palace, shrouded in medical secrecy. But the aggressive treatments began immediately, and the devastating physical toll on his aging body quickly became impossible to hide from the public eye. Then, as if that physical deterioration was not already enough to completely break a man's spirit, came the devastating blow of March 2024. It was during this dark spring that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, announced her own cancer diagnosis following a complex abdominal surgery, forcing her to step back completely from all public duties for months of intense chemotherapy. Within a mere 6 weeks, both the reigning king and the beloved wife of his immediate heir were fighting for their lives against cancer at the exact same time. The monarchy was bleeding from every conceivable direction at once. The royal roster of working royals was depleted to a dangerous low, and the man who was supposed to be steering the entire ship of state through the storm was barely capable of keeping himself upright. Into this massive power vacuum, William moved. He did not arrive with grand, theatrical speeches or flashy press releases designed to court temporary public favor. He moved quietly, decisively, and with a terrifyingly sharp focus that left absolutely no room for misunderstanding about exactly where the true center of royal power was heading. The first undeniable, visible sign of this historic shift came in 2025, when Charles officially handed Prince William and Catherine the authority to issue royal warrants. This is the highly coveted, traditional right to publicly endorse luxury brands and products on behalf of the British Crown. To an outsider, this might sound like a minor administrative detail, a piece of bureaucratic paperwork buried deep within court circulars, but inside the royal household, it was anything but trivial. British monarchs had historically kept this exclusive privilege locked tightly in their own hands until their final breath, viewing it as a core symbol of sovereign approval. Handing it over while still sitting on the throne was an unprecedented institutional signal, and every single courtier and staff member inside Buckingham Palace read the writing on the wall with perfect clarity. But the transfer of commercial warrants was merely the gentle beginning of what was actually being shifted behind the heavy curtains of the palace. The real, brutal shift of executive power was happening directly within the management of the escalating Prince Andrew crisis, and it was moving at a speed that shocked the old guard. Over the 6 months leading up to the historic February 2026 arrest, William had quietly become the sole individual making every single major decision involving his disgraced uncle. The sudden removal of Andrew's remaining military titles and royal patronages in late 2025, the carefully engineered, ruthless eviction of Andrew from the grand estate of Royal Lodge, and every single strategic public statement that emerged from the palace press office regarding the matter had William's fingerprints written all over them. One senior royal source disclosed to international news agencies that Charles was actively guiding William to make these harsh, necessary choices, knowing full well that the entire survival of the monarchy rested squarely on the shoulders of the Wales family. But if you strip away the polite, diplomatic language of the official palace briefings and look at the raw reality, what that actually meant was this: Charles had effectively stopped leading. The king was no longer driving the vehicle of state. He was merely a passenger being carried along by the momentum of his son. Furthermore, William's approach to running the monarchy was something entirely new, a modern doctrine that was making the traditional courtiers deeply uncomfortable and resentful. Where Charles had always operated through ancient tradition, emotional instinct, and a deeply personal attachment to ceremony, historical continuity, and family loyalty, William was approaching the centuries-old institution like a cold chief executive officer who had just inherited a massive, multi-billion-dollar corporation in the middle of a catastrophic public relations crisis. He demanded clear reporting structures, professional corporate accountability, and implemented a policy of absolute zero tolerance for anyone inside the royal organization who created reputational damage, regardless of their bloodline or status. William had already successfully demonstrated the effectiveness of this corporate model through the way he managed his royal foundation, the primary charitable vehicle he operates with Catherine. That foundation functions precisely like a modern tech company, utilizing a powerful chief executive, a formal board of directors, strictly published performance goals, and regular transparent public updates. William intended to bring that exact same unyielding corporate model to the ancient apparatus of the monarchy itself. One former senior royal aide described William's management style with a single, chilling word: relentless. He questioned every expenditure. He challenged long-standing, archaic practices that nobody else in the family had dared to touch for a century, and he made it abundantly clear to everyone around him that the days of powerful, aristocratic courtiers making monumental decisions behind closed doors, with no accountability to the public, were officially finished. And what all of this administrative displacement was doing to Charles as a man, not as a sovereign, but as a vulnerable human being, was something far darker and more tragic than any official palace source would ever be willing to admit to the press. High-level insiders revealed that the ongoing Andrew situation had become an unbearable psychological burden for Charles, and that his physical health had deteriorated rapidly, and specifically because of the crushing, agonizing weight of this familial betrayal. He had reportedly confessed to his closest confidants that he felt completely and utterly betrayed by Andrew, that he had been systematically lied to by his own brother for decades, and that he feared with immense sorrow that he might never speak to Andrew again before one of them passed away. When you pause to think about what that means for a moment, the tragedy is immense. Charles waited 70 years for the crown, dreaming of a glorious, historic reign that would be his lasting legacy, his great, progressive contribution to the institution to which he had dedicated his entire earthly existence. And instead of that dream, his actual reign was being entirely defined by a criminally compromised brother, a body that was slowly but surely surrendering to an aggressive disease, unanswered public questions about his own historical role in the palace cover-up, and a fiercely disciplined son who had quietly, effectively walked into the room and taken over the governance of the realm while Charles was still physically sitting in the monarch's chair. And then came the ultimate heavy detail that very few people outside the inner sanctum of the palace are talking about openly. An official, highly detailed abdication plan is currently being actively rehearsed in total private. High-level insiders confirmed that these secret rehearsals were already well underway behind closed doors, meticulously modeled on the sudden abdication of Denmark's Queen Margrethe, which had been executed with a level of smoothness, modern efficiency, and institutional dignity that the British palace was now desperately trying to replicate to avoid further chaos. A senior courtier revealed that when Charles finally steps back from the throne, the public presentation will look perfectly measured, calm, and dignified, with his failing health being utilized as the primary official explanation, because it is the one undeniable reason that the British public simply cannot argue with or criticize. But then came the single, devastating sentence from that same insider that completely ripped the dignity out of every carefully chosen word that preceded it. The source made it clear that William had already taken on so much executive work and daily authority that the formal abdication, when it finally happens in front of the world's cameras, will simply be a matter of legal paperwork confirming a total handover of power that has already completely taken place in reality. To truly grasp the devastating finality of the architectural shift inside the British monarchy, one must look closely at the personal collapse of Queen Camilla. Before one can even begin to understand how far Camilla has fallen from the peaks of influence within Buckingham Palace, it is essential to remember how impossibly far she had already climbed against all historical odds. For most of the 1990s and the traumatic early years of the 2000s, Camilla was undisputed as the most despised, publicly hated woman in the entire United Kingdom. She was permanently labeled as the other woman, the toxic shadow that had stretched across the tragic marriage of the most beloved, iconic royal figure in modern history, Diana, Princess of Wales. When Diana sat across from a BBC interviewer in 1995 and delivered that historic sentence to 200 million people watching in every corner of the planet, stating that there were 3 people in her marriage and that it was a bit crowded. The entire world knew precisely who that third person was. And when Diana met her tragic, untimely death in a Paris tunnel in August 1997 at just 36 years old, the overwhelming grief of a shocked generation curdled into something incredibly ugly, and that collective national rage landed squarely upon the shoulders of Camilla. The public hostility was so severe that she required expensive, heavy private security just to attend basic events that other minor royals attended with absolute freedom. Yet, Camilla fought her way back through decades of grinding, exhausting, thankless public relations work, slowly enduring the baseline of national rejection. She married Charles in 2005, took on deeply difficult charitable causes, and kept her absolute composure through waves of press mockery that would have completely shattered most ordinary human beings. By the time of the grand coronation in May 2023, she had successfully clawed back enough of the public's basic tolerance to stand inside Westminster Abbey and be officially crowned Queen Consort without the entire country erupting into open protest. By any honest historical measure, it was one of the most remarkable, calculated political comebacks in British royal history. But there was one central person who had watched every single step of that historical comeback with sharp, cold eyes that never fully warmed to her presence: Prince William. When Camilla arrived at Clarence House for her first real, highly sensitive meeting with William years ago, royal biographers reported that she was shaking so violently that she required a strong drink just to steady her nerves before walking into the room. Camilla knew precisely what she had done to this boy's childhood, the psychological trauma she had inflicted upon his mother. And William stood there during that meeting with his face completely still, a master of emotional discipline, giving away absolutely nothing. He and Prince Harry had reportedly begged their father, pleading with Charles not to marry this woman, but Charles had ignored his sons and married her anyway. Something deep within William's core had never fully healed from that institutional betrayal. A palace insider stated without any hesitation that the specific way Camilla had systematically betrayed their mother had never been forgotten or forgiven by either of Diana's sons, and William, being far more controlled and strategically minded than Harry, had simply been infinitely more disciplined about hiding his resentment until the perfect moment of structural leverage arrived. The catalyst that finally cracked William's disciplined composure wide open was Camilla's stubborn, misplaced personal loyalty to Sarah Ferguson. The two women had been fiercely close friends since the late 1970s, long before either of them had ever set foot inside a royal palace or married a son of Queen Elizabeth. To Camilla, this was a sacred, lifelong friendship that existed completely outside the cold demands of the institution, a bond rooted in decades of shared personal history and mutual survival. To Prince William, however, Sarah Ferguson was a catastrophic, high-risk institutional liability operating at the worst possible moment in the monarchy's recent history. Sarah Ferguson's name had been dragged repeatedly through the highly explosive, unsealed Department of Justice files released in the United States, which detailed the financial operations of Jeffrey Epstein. In official emails, Sarah appeared to have contacted Epstein directly during a period when her personal businesses were collapsing, explicitly asking the convicted predator for large sums of money. While there were no criminal charges filed against her, her financial connection to Epstein was an undeniable legal fact. Her domestic connection to the arrested Prince Andrew was absolute, and in the middle of the most devastating royal security scandal in a century, Camilla's decision to publicly stand by her and offer personal comfort was something William was never going to tolerate or forgive. Consequently, William delivered a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum to the Queen Consort. He told Camilla directly that the only survival strategy for the crown was a total, immediate, and permanent separation from Sarah Ferguson, with no gray areas, no private phone calls, and absolutely no exceptions. He informed her that there was no room for private emotional loyalties or mixed institutional messages, and that every single individual wearing a royal title needed to be completely aligned with his crisis strategy. Imagine being the crowned queen consort of the United Kingdom and being spoken to in such a demanding, subordinate manner by a stepson who is not yet king. Camilla reportedly erupted in absolute fury, confronting Charles and stating that William had massively overstepped his constitutional position, that he was not yet the monarch, and that he held absolutely no legal right to issue corporate ultimatums to her as though she were a junior member of the palace staff. And then came the exact moment that must have felt like the floor completely dropping out from under her entire life's work. Charles, the man she had sacrificed decades of her life for, the man for whom she had endured global hatred, intense humiliation, and the absolute destruction of her reputation, looked at her with fading eyes and chose his son over his wife. As if that institutional rejection was not already enough to break Camilla's spirit, what happened next finished her standing in the court of public opinion in a way from which she could never recover. During an official royal engagement, Camilla met with a global symbol of courage who was a survivor of horrific abuse. Camilla positioned herself directly in front of the assembled international media cameras, trying to showcase herself as a passionate, leading supporter of abuse survivors worldwide. The public backlash that erupted immediately afterward was unlike anything the palace press office had seen in a decade. The public demanded to know how the queen consort could publicly hold the hand of a survivor on television, while privately refusing to distance herself from the inner circle of a prince arrested for enabling a convicted global predator. Behind closed doors, William had already issued a directive to his entire staff that left no room for interpretation. He stated clearly that anyone who brought reputational scandal to the monarchy, regardless of their personal relationship to him or the king, would be systematically removed from the public frame. That specific word did not need any further clarification. Everyone inside Buckingham Palace knew exactly that the weapon was aimed directly at Camilla. And while William was politically tearing into Camilla over her institutional liabilities, Catherine was executing a strategy that Camilla found even harder to swallow, establishing a total contrast of power. In the critical hours following the arrest of Prince Andrew, Catherine moved into active crisis management with a level of precision that made it appear as though she had been waiting for exactly this moment to secure the future. She was coordinating directly with top-tier legal advisors on how to mathematically shape the palace's public relations output, sitting directly inside high-level strategy meetings with senior civil servants, and working relentlessly to contain the historical blast radius of the scandal. Sources confirmed that Camilla's internal reaction to Catherine's executive involvement was immediate and ferocious. She felt that Catherine's highly visible, incredibly active leadership was screaming to the global public that Charles and Camilla were entirely incapable of managing their own household. Camilla began telling her remaining allies that Catherine was deliberately making her and the reigning king look weak, helpless, and obsolete in front of the entire world. Charles responded to these complaints by defending Catherine every single time, telling his furious wife that Catherine was the only one successfully keeping the institution afloat. What made this dynamic utterly unbearable for Camilla was the unyielding, undeniable reality of public perception. Catherine possessed an innate, magnetic public appeal that Camilla simply could never replicate, no matter how many decades she worked. When they appeared at state events together, the cameras naturally sought Catherine. When they walked into grand rooms, the diplomatic conversation naturally gravitated toward Catherine. Camilla had spent 20 years trying to build a respected, stable public image. But respect and adoration are two entirely different currencies, and the global public relationship with Catherine was rooted in pure adoration. This quiet war had been building long before the current arrest gave it a definitive detonator. And the single moment that transformed it from a cold, passive-aggressive tension into open, hostile warfare happened when Camilla allegedly made a dismissive gesture toward Catherine during a highly sensitive private exchange with visiting foreign dignitaries, attempting to wave her out of the conversation. Palace staff witnessed the interaction, and the story spread through courtier circles like wildfire through dry wood. What had been a managed rivalry became from that moment forward open institutional warfare that was impossible to contain. Catherine did not retreat a single inch. Her strategic allies took the fight directly into the palace communications department, painting the picture of her future reign so boldly, loudly, and publicly that they were actively shoving Camilla out of the media frame, while Camilla was still the sitting queen consort. It was Catherine's camp drawing the definitive map of the future monarchy, ensuring Camilla could read every single line of her own looming irrelevance. And then came the final, tragic detail that should have shattered Camilla entirely. Charles had gone to William privately, as a failing father asking a deeply painful, final personal favor of his son, pleading with William to allow Camilla to find a quiet, dignified place within the architecture of the monarchy after Charles was gone, asking his heir to leave her with some baseline of comfort. William reportedly agreed to the request, but the terms of that agreement were entirely William's to define. Camilla's future funding, her security apparatus, her access to royal properties, and her ultimate relevance within the royal family would exist solely as long as William and Catherine allowed them to exist. The woman who endured 2 decades of being called a homewrecker to her face. The woman who fought her way back from the ashes of Diana's death. The woman who stood inside Westminster Abbey and was crowned queen consort against all historical probability, will now spend her remaining years completely dependent upon the mercy and approval of the stepchildren who remember exactly what she did to their family.